The air in the Utah desert is heavy, not with the heat of the salt flats, but with a silence that feels violent. It is the sound of an engine that has finally, mercifully, stopped screaming. Dave Sparks, known to a global audience as the indomitable Heavy D, stands amidst the skeletal remains of a custom steel Titan, his hands stained with grease and a deeper, invisible soot. For years, the world watched him conquer the impossible, turning rusted iron into monuments of American power. But they never saw the slow erosion of the man beneath the brand. Behind the roaring laughter and the smoke of spinning tires lay a cavernous isolation, a psyche stretched thin by the relentless demand to be larger than life. The cameras captured the triumph. They missed the moment his internal compass shattered. How does a man who built an empire on the strength of steel survive the realization that his own foundation is made of glass? The dawn over the Utah high desert does not break so much as it bruises, bleeding a cold, jagged purple across the Ochre Mountains. In the blue-gray shadows of the Diesel brothers' sprawling compound, the silence is heavy, a physical weight that presses against the corrugated metal of the massive garage bays. Before the first air compressor kicks to life, before the swarm of camera operators and production assistants descend with their cables and artificial lights, there is Dave Sparks. He stands alone in the center of the shop, a silhouette framed by the skeletal remains of a monster truck, a titan of steel and rubber that seems to be watching him. To the world, he is Heavy D, a name synonymous with indestructible American grit, a man who bends iron to his will. But in this pre-dawn stillness, the persona feels less like an achievement and more like a shroud. The air here is thick, a visceral soup of aerosol grease, burnt diesel, and the metallic tang of fresh welds. It is the scent of his empire, yet today, it feels suffocating. As he runs a calloused hand over the cold flank of a custom chassis, the narrator observes the subtle tremor in his grip, not from weakness, but from a profound, crystalline exhaustion that has begun to settle into his marrow. The Heavy D the world demands is a man of infinite kinetic energy, a loud, laughing architect of chaos who never tires, never doubts, and never blinks. But inside the quiet theater of his own mind, Dave is navigating a labyrinth of expectations that have become a cage. He is the sun around which hundreds of employees, a global television audience, and a massive brand revolve. He knows with a terrifying certainty that if he falters, the gravity of that entire world will collapse upon those he loves. The production crew arrives, and the atmosphere shifts instantly. The silence is violated by the rhythmic clatter of equipment cases and the bark of directors. Dave feels the familiar mask sliding into place. It is a practiced alchemy, transforming the hollow ache in his chest into a boisterous, televised bravado. He steps into the light of the high-definition cameras, his smile wide and convincing, yet the lens captures a flickering shadow in his eyes that no studio lighting can erase. Every joke he cracks, every larger-than-life gesture he performs for the rolling tape, feels like a slow-motion betrayal of the man underneath. He is cannibalizing his own peace to feed the beast of the brand. As the day wanes and the final shot of the episode is called, the shop erupts in cheers. The crew is ecstatic. They have captured another moment of manufactured triumph. His partners slap him on the back, their voices echoing off the steel rafters, but Dave is already elsewhere. He is staring through the dust motes dancing in a singular shaft of dying sunlight, his thoughts drifting to the structural integrity of his own soul. He has built machines that can survive a roll down a mountain, but he realizes with a jolt of internal panic that he has no such reinforcement for himself. The applause fades into a ringing in his ears, a psychic white noise. He looks at the heavy industrial doors of the compound, sensing a coming storm, a psychological tectonic shift that no reinforced chassis, no matter how overbuilt, can possibly weather. The cameras are powered down, but the weight of the crown remains, pressing harder now than it ever has before. He wonders, as he watches the last car leave the lot, if the man he was is already buried beneath the iron he created. The visual palette shifts, the vibrant, high-contrast saturation of the modern desert bleeding into the hazy, sepia-toned dust of a Utah morning decades ago. This is the landscape of a boy navigating a world that felt too vast and far too fragile. We see a young Dave Sparks, his frame smaller but his eyes possessed by a restless, kinetic intelligence that the traditional world, the world of quiet classrooms and still postures, never knew how to contain. The narrator observes him not as a child at play, but as a child at work, his small, dirt-caked fingers meticulously articulating the gears of a discarded bicycle. Even then, the air around him hummed with a quiet desperation, a foundational understanding that in the harsh, beautiful topography of his upbringing, worth was not a given. It was something earned through utility. The psychological imprint of these formative years is a study in the architecture of survival. The narration pulls us into the interiority of a boy who equated love with being useful and safety with being strong. In this rugged terrain, strength was the only acceptable currency, a hard-won armor against the unpredictabilities of a life that demanded resilience. We see him in a series of vignettes, hauling heavy stones to clear a path, fixing what was broken before others even noticed the fracture, and always building. He was not merely assembling machines. He was constructing a version of himself that was intended to be bulletproof. Each successful repair was a brick in a rising wall, a sanctuary of steel designed to shield a sensitive, searching soul that felt the world's edges too sharply. He learned early that the world does not ask how you feel if you are the one making sure the engines are running. This heavy archetype was not born of ego, but of a profound, unspoken need to provide, to be the unshakable pillar upon which others could lean. The camera lingers on a young Dave standing atop a ridge he has just conquered, the wind whipping his hair, his face set in a mask of premature stoicism. Yet, even in these early victories, a haunting psychological shadow begins to lengthen. The narrator reveals a recurring night terror that plagued his youth, a dream of a magnificent, towering structure made of solid iron, built by his own hands, that grows so massive it begins to groan under its own impossible density. In the dream, he watches the foundation crack not because of an external blow, but because the very material he used to ensure its strength has become too heavy for the earth to hold. It is a chilling foreshadowing of a collapse that would remain dormant for decades. As we watch the boy transition into a young man, the transition is marked by the scale of his creations. The bicycles become trucks. The trucks become statements of defiance. He moves through the world with an increasing intensity, a man who believes that if he can just build something large enough, stable enough, and loud enough, the quiet voice of his own vulnerability will finally be silenced. He is a master of the external, a wizard of the mechanical, but the narrator notes the deepening isolation in his gaze as he stares at his finished work. He stands before a reinforced chassis, the sunlight glinting off the polished chrome, unaware that he is perfecting his own cage. The chapter closes on a lingering shot of the boy's reflection in a puddle of oil, distorted, dark, and unreachable. Was he truly building a life of purpose, or was he merely constructing the world's most elaborate hiding place? The screen dissolves into a frantic, strobe-like montage of the Diesel brothers' global ascendancy, but the colors are bled out, viewed through a distorted, melancholic filter that drains the joy from the spectacle. We see the million-dollar builds, the gravity-defying jumps, and the sea of screaming fans at automotive expos, but the audio is not the expected roar of a 1,000-horsepower engine. Instead, it is a low, rhythmic thrum, the sound of a heartbeat accelerated by anxiety rather than adrenaline. Dave is at the center of every frame, the charismatic son of a multi-million-dollar solar system. The narrator observes the performative ease with which he navigates this world, yet as the camera lingers on his face between takes, the mask slips. The Heavy D persona has become a high-performance vehicle that Dave is forced to drive at redline, 24 hours a day, with no off-ramp in sight. The visceral loneliness of the peak is a quiet, suffocating cold. We see Dave in a crowded room, flanked by his brothers, men who share his sweat, his grease, and his vision. Yet he is psychologically adrift. The narrator delves into the crushing paradox of the alpha, the man who has built a kingdom of loyalty but cannot afford a single moment of visible doubt. To his crew, he is the provider. To his family, he is the protector. To millions of viewers, he is the avatar of American invincibility. But who is he to himself? The internal conflict is a slow-motion car crash of identity. He has achieved the quintessential American dream: the fame, the fleet of vehicles, the influence, only to find that at the summit, the air is too thin to breathe. The success he spent his youth building now tastes like ash in his mouth, a hollow victory that demands he trade his soul for more content, more builds, and more growth. The shop, once a playground of mechanical wonder, has transformed into a factory of relentless pressure. The camera follows Dave as he walks through the hangar at night, the overhead fluorescent lights humming with an aggressive, sterile frequency. He looks at a line of trucks waiting for his approval, and for the first time, he doesn't see art. He sees obligations. He is a provider for hundreds of families, a responsibility that sits on his chest like a lead weight. The narrator notes the deepening lines around his eyes, the way his laughter in the footage now sounds like a rehearsed echo. He is a stranger to his own reflection in the polished chrome of a custom grill. He is the man who can fix anything with a wrench, yet he is staring at a fracture within his own spirit that no amount of torque can tighten. As the fame reaches a fever pitch, the psychological cost becomes undeniable. The first cracks appear, not in the hardened steel of his chassis or the reliability of his engines, but in his very ability to experience joy. The things that once fueled him, the smell of fresh tires, the first start of a new build, the camaraderie of the shop, now trigger a sense of profound, inexplicable dread. He is trapped in a cycle of perpetual motion, a shark that will die if it stops swimming. The narrator describes a moment of terrifying clarity. Dave standing on a stage before thousands of cheering people, feeling a sudden, violent urge to simply walk away into the darkness. He has everything he ever wanted, yet he feels as though he is starving in the middle of a feast. The chapter ends with a haunting visual. Dave sitting in the driver's seat of his most famous truck, the engine idling, his hands gripped so tight on the steering wheel that his knuckles turn white. He is the master of the machine, but as he stares into the rearview mirror, he realizes he no longer recognizes the man looking back. If this is what winning feels like, why does it feel so much like losing? The vibrant orange of the workshop's welding sparks fades into a cold, clinical blue. The air in the compound, once alive with the rhythmic percussion of pneumatic tools and the boisterous laughter of a brotherhood, has curdled into a heavy, stagnant tension. The camera moves with a slow, predatory intent, lingering on stacks of legal documents and the sterile glare of laptop screens that have replaced the visceral joy of the fabrication table. This is the winter of the diesel empire. The narrator observes Dave Sparks not as the conquering hero, but as a man under siege, the psychological burden manifesting in the rigid, defensive set of his shoulders and the way his gaze remains fixed on the floor. The environmental scrutiny and the relentless, public legal battles have become a different kind of engine, one that consumes peace and exhausts the spirit. The pressure is no longer about the next build. It is about the survival of a myth. The narration explores the corrosive fear of being found out, a deep-seated imposter syndrome not related to his undeniable mechanical genius, but to his human fragility. To the world, Heavy D is a force of nature, an immovable object. But inside the quiet sanctum of his mind, Dave is a man who is bleeding out from 1,000 microscopic cuts. Every legal filing, every headline questioning his integrity, and every vitriolic comment from a digital stranger acts as a hammer blow against the psychological armor he spent a lifetime welding together. He is trapped in a psychological death march, forced to maintain the image of the unstoppable diesel brother while his internal foundations are liquefying. The narrator notes the way he pulls away from the touch of his peers. As if intimacy itself were a threat to the crumbling facade he is so desperately trying to prop up. He begins to withdraw, the vibrant energy that once defined the shop replaced by a suffocating dread. We see him walking through the bays, but he no longer sees the beauty in the steel. He sees liabilities. He sees the weight of 100 employees whose livelihoods are tethered to his ability to remain unbroken. The camera captures him in his office, the only light coming from the harsh glow of a monitor, his face cast in a ghostly, digital pallor. The narrator describes the visceral sensation of metal fatiguing, the way a structural beam doesn't snap instantly, but develops microscopic fissures that spread until the entire integrity is compromised. Dave is feeling those fissures spreading through his own chest. He is the master of the overbuilt machine, yet he has neglected the maintenance of his own soul. The social media feeds continue to roll, a blurred stream of judgment and expectation that he cannot escape. He is the villain in one narrative and the hero in another, but in his own story, he is simply exhausted. The chapter culminates in a devastatingly quiet scene. The shop is empty, the crews have long since gone home, and only a single, flickering overhead light remains. Dave sits alone on a cold metal stool in the center of the darkened garage, the silence around him so absolute it feels deafening. He rests his head in his hands, his breath ragged in the cavernous space. The narrator observes the profound irony of the moment. He is surrounded by the strongest materials on Earth, yet he is faced with the terrifying realization that metal isn't the only thing that eventually breaks under relentless, unyielding stress. If the strongest man in the room finally snaps, who is left to hold up the ceiling? The cinematic roar that has defined Dave Sparks' existence for a decade does not end with a climactic explosion or a final, defiant rev of an engine. Instead, it fades into a haunting, low-frequency hum. The sound of a machine being unplugged, the power slowly draining until the gears grind to a painful, shuddering halt. The tragedy of this chapter is found in the silence. We witness the Great Deceleration, a period of quiet, total surrender where the momentum of $1 million empire finally meets the immovable object of human burnout. The camera captures the messy, unglamorous dismantling of the life Dave knew, stripped of the glossy post-production and the heroic music. It is the visual equivalent of a controlled demolition, watching the heavy-D mythos crumble into a pile of steel and dust, leaving the man behind the mask standing in the debris, exposed and utterly alone. The narrative follows Dave through the wreckage of his own ambition. The unplugging is not a peaceful retreat. It is an agonizing psychological divorce from the only identity he has ever known. The narrator observes the profound emotional wreckage of stepping back from the spotlight, the way his hands shake when they aren't holding a steering wheel or a microphone. Without the constant, deafening noise of the engines and the blinding glare of the studio lights, Dave is forced into a terrifying vacuum. The narrator asks the question that Dave cannot bring himself to voice. Stripped of the power, the fame, and the metal, who is Dave Sparks? The identity crisis is visceral. He moves through his own home like a ghost, a stranger in a life he worked 1,000 nights to build. He looks at his reflection and sees not a mogul, but a man who has lost the map to his own soul. This downfall is treated not as a failure of industry, but as a necessary, brutal death of the ego. The camera lingers on Dave as he sits in his quiet backyard, the Utah horizon stretching out like an infinite, indifferent witness to his grief. He is mourning. He is mourning the loss of the invincible version of himself, the one who never felt pain and never admitted defeat. The narrator explores the reality of his burnout, describing it as a scorched earth event within his psyche. There are moments of profound sorrow as he surveys the strained relationships left in the wake of his rise, the friends who became employees, the family time sacrificed to the altar of the algorithm, and the brotherhood that grew thin under the weight of a brand. He realizes that in his quest to build a fortress of steel, he inadvertently walled himself off from the very people he was trying to protect. The heavy D persona was a shield, but as the ego dies, Dave is forced to feel the raw, unbuffered impact of his own choices. We see him walking along the edge of the desert, the wind whipping a fine grit against his skin, his silhouette looking fragile against the prehistoric scale of the mountains. He is a man in the middle of a spiritual audit, tallying the cost of his success and finding himself deep in the red. The narrator notes the way he looks at his calloused palms, wondering if they are still capable of holding anything that isn't made of iron. The chapter reaches its emotional peak as he watches the sun dip below the salt flats, casting long, distorted shadows across the sand. He is standing at the precipice of a new, terrifyingly quiet life, wondering if the foundations he cracked can ever be repaired. He has dismantled the machine, but as the darkness of the desert night closes in, a haunting uncertainty remains. In the process of saving himself, has he destroyed too much to ever truly rebuild? The final movement of this odyssey does not arrive with the thunder of a 1,000-horsepower engine, but with the soft, rhythmic rasp of a handplane moving across cedar. The visual language shifts from the industrial grit of the compound to a setting that feels sacred and small, a private workshop tucked away from the prying eyes of the digital world. The lighting is no longer the harsh, clinical blue of the garage, but a warm, honeyed amber that spills across Dave Sparks' face as he works in a deliberate, unhurried silence. The narrator observes a profound transformation in his hands. They are still calloused, still stained by the history of his labor, but they no longer move with the frantic, jagged energy of a man outrunning a ghost. He is no longer chasing the loudest roar in the desert. He is listening for the quietest truth in his own chest. The Diesel brother has been dismantled piece by piece, and in his place stands a man who has become the architect of his own stillness. We see him in moments of unvarnished intimacy, kneeling in a garden, the soil beneath his fingernails a different kind of earth than the grease of his past, sitting in a long, unbroken silence with his family, where no cameras are rolling and no performance is required. The narrator explores the psychological grace of this rebirth, noting that Dave has finally realized that a true legacy is not built in iron or steel or the ratings of a television network. It is built in the fragile, invisible spaces between people and in the peace a man makes with the shadows that once threatened to swallow him whole. He carries the scars of the past years not as failures, but as necessary welds, reinforcements that make a structure stronger because it was once broken. There is a tragic beauty in his reflection. Through the third-person lens, we see him looking at old footage of Heavy D, and the expression on his face is one of distant, compassionate recognition. He acknowledges with a heavy, lyrical sadness that he can never return to the man he was. That version of himself is buried under the salt of the desert. But for the first time in a decade, he finally likes the man he is becoming. He has traded the adrenaline of the crowd for the steady, reliable pulse of a life lived with intention. He has learned that the most difficult build he ever faced was not a monster truck, but the reconstruction of his own identity after the spotlight went dark. As the sun begins its slow descent over the jagged Utah peaks, painting the horizon in a final, defiant wash of gold and violet, Dave stands on his porch, his chest rising and falling in a slow, even cadence. He is a man who has survived the crash. Yet, as the narrator pulls back, leaving him a small figure against the vast, darkening landscape, one final, lingering question remains, unbidden and sharp. Can a man who lived so long for the thunderous applause of a global audience ever truly be content with the solitary, rhythmic sound of his own breath?